By the late 1970s, something had shifted in rock music. It was hard to name at first. The guitars were still loud, the arenas were still full, but underneath all of it, there was a strange quiet growing, a feeling of distance, a sense that the music had started talking to itself because it no longer knew who was listening. This is not a story about rock dying, it is a story about rock becoming tired, and in that tiredness, discovering something it had avoided for years: honesty. To understand the late 70s, you have to understand what came before. The 1960s promised everything: revolution, freedom, a complete reimagining of what society could become. Rock music carried those promises on its back. It was the soundtrack to change. But by 1975, the promises had begun to feel hollow. The war in Vietnam had ended, but not cleanly. Watergate had exposed something rotten in the country's foundation. The economy stumbled. Oil prices rose. Inflation crept into everyday life like a quiet thief. The optimism that fueled the 60s did not die suddenly. It faded, slowly. The way a bruise fades, leaving behind a dull ache you learn to ignore. Rock music absorbed all of this. It could not help it. Music always reflects the emotional temperature of its time, and the temperature in the late 70s was complicated. There was still energy, there was still defiance, people were tired, not of music, of believing that music could change anything. By 1976, the music industry had become something enormous. Record sales reached heights that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Tours filled stadiums. Contracts involved millions of dollars. Rock music was no longer a rebellious voice from the margins, it was a business, and businesses operate on different principles than art. Albums were engineered for radio play. Songs were shaped to fit certain formats. The rough edges that once made rock feel dangerous were smoothed away. This was not a conspiracy. It was simply what happens when something grows too large. The personal becomes professional. The intimate becomes industrial. Many musicians found themselves caught in a strange position. They were more successful than ever. They were also more isolated than ever. The distance between the stage and the audience grew wider, not physically, emotionally. When you perform for 20,000 people, you are not truly connecting with any single one of them. By 1977, rock music was no longer one thing. It had fractured into many different directions. There was arena rock, filling massive spaces with walls of sound. There was progressive rock, reaching toward complexity and precision. There was the early stirrings of punk, rejecting everything that came before. And there was disco, pulling audiences away entirely. Each of these movements carried its own energy, but they also represented different responses to the same underlying exhaustion. Arena rock tried to go bigger, hoping volume could fill the emptiness. Progressive rock tried to go deeper, hoping intelligence could provide meaning. Punk tried to burn everything down, hoping destruction could create renewal. Disco tried to escape entirely, hoping movement could replace thought. None of these approaches were wrong, but none of them fully addressed what was happening beneath the surface. Rock music was having a quiet crisis of identity. It no longer knew what it was for. In the 1960s, the purpose had been clear: challenge authority, expand consciousness, build community. But by the late 70s, authority had proven it could absorb any challenge. Consciousness had expanded, but into what? And community had splintered into demographics. The music kept playing, the crowds kept gathering, but the sense of shared purpose had faded. And without shared purpose, connection becomes performance. Something interesting began to happen in the music itself. Lyrics started turning inward. Not all of them, but enough to notice a pattern. Songs became more personal, more uncertain, more willing to admit confusion. Many of the musicians who defined the early 70s were approaching middle age. Their bodies were tired from years of touring. Their minds were clouded from years of excess. Their relationships had often collapsed under the weight of constant travel and public scrutiny. Some had lost friends to overdoses or accidents. Some had watched their bands disintegrate from internal conflict. Some had simply grown apart from who they used to be. This is normal. People change. But the music industry does not make room for change. It demands that artists remain frozen in their most successful version, forever young, forever hungry, forever on fire. When the fire dims, the industry moves on. It finds someone newer, someone younger, someone who still believes the promises. The musicians left behind often felt like they had been used. By 1979, the audience for rock music was changing, not disappearing, changing. The teenagers who had defined the rock audience in the 60s were now in their 30s. They had jobs. They had families. They had less time to follow every new release. They still bought albums, but they bought them differently, with nostalgia instead of urgency, with appreciation instead of need. Meanwhile, a new generation was emerging, a generation that had no memory of the 60s, no memory of the promises, no emotional investment in what rock music was supposed to represent. To them, rock was just one option among many, not a movement, not an identity, just sound. This was not a betrayal. It was simply the passage of time. But it left rock music in a peculiar position, too established to feel rebellious, too exhausted to reinvent itself, too proud to admit it needed help. The loneliness deepened, not from losing fans, from losing meaning. If you listen carefully to late 70s rock, you hear something besides the music. You hear the spaces between, the moments where the guitar pauses and only the drums continue, the quiet intros before the chorus arrives, the way certain vocals crack, just slightly, from strain. These are not mistakes, they are truth leaking through. The performers were human, the songs were armor, but armor wears thin. In those quiet spaces, you can feel something honest, exhaustion that could not be hidden, doubt that could not be suppressed, a longing for something simpler, for smaller rooms, for fewer expectations, for audiences that wanted to listen instead of be entertained. Many of the best moments from this era exist in those spaces, not in the loudest parts, in the pauses where the human being behind the instrument becomes visible. Just for a moment, before the machinery starts again, every successful artist faces a peculiar burden, the burden of repetition. Fans want the feeling they had the first time they heard a certain song. They want it again and again. The artist is expected to provide that feeling on demand, night after night, album after album. But feelings do not work that way. They evolve, they deepen, they change direction. By the late 70s, many rock musicians were caught between what they had become and what they wanted to explore. The industry wanted more of the same. The audiences wanted more of the same. But the artists themselves were different people than they had been 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier. This creates a kind of internal exile. You are surrounded by people, but none of them see who you actually are. They see a version of you that no longer exists, and you are expected to perform that version convincingly, forever. The loneliness this produces is specific. It is the loneliness of being seen without being known. Disco and punk were often presented as opposites. One was glamorous and polished, the other was raw and confrontational, but both were responses to the same exhaustion. Disco offered escape, a world of lights and movement where you did not have to think about the heaviness outside. Punk offered destruction, a declaration that everything built in the previous decade was corrupt and needed to be torn down. Rock music watched both of these movements rise, and it could not compete with either. Rock was too burdened to offer pure escape, too invested in its own history to embrace destruction, so it sat in the middle, uncomfortable, uncertain, wondering if the world still had room for music that tried to be both honest and beautiful. The answer was complicated. Rock music in the late 70s began its slow migration toward the margins. Not the underground, the margins. By the late 70s, rock music had accumulated a vast audience of these private listeners. People who did not attend concerts, people who did not follow trends, people who simply needed the sound of someone else working through the same confusion they felt. This audience was invisible, but it was loyal, and it changed the relationship between the music and its purpose. Rock was no longer primarily communal. It was becoming something more private, something passed between two people, the voice on the record and the person listening. The late 1970s did not kill rock music. That is a story people tell because it has clean edges. Reality is messier. Rock music continued. It evolved. It fractured into new forms that would dominate the next decade. But something was lost in the transition. The sense of collective purpose that defined the 60s and early 70s did not return. What replaced it was something more individual, more solitary, more willing to sit with ambiguity. This is not a tragedy. It is simply what happens when a form matures. The urgency fades. The wisdom arrives. Not the wisdom of answers, the wisdom of better questions. Rock music in the late 70s asked questions it had avoided. What happens after the revolution fails? What do you do when the party ends? How do you make meaning when meaning no longer announces itself? These are uncomfortable questions. They do not produce anthems. They produce something else. Quieter, heavier, more lasting. If you could listen to the late 1970s as a single sound, it would not be an explosion. It would be a long exhale. The kind you release after holding your breath for too long. The relief is real, but so is the exhaustion. Rock music did not disappear in those years. It did not surrender. It simply stopped pretending to be invincible. And in that admission, it found something it had lost in the noise. Itself. Smaller than before, quieter than before, more alone than before, but perhaps, finally, more honest. The loneliness was not the ending. It was the beginning of something else. Something we are still trying to name. The question you might carry with you is simple. What happens to anything, or anyone, when the noise stops? What remains? And is that remainder enough? Rock music answered that question in the late 70s. Not with words, with silence, with presence, with the willingness to keep going when the world had already moved on. Perhaps that is the most honest thing any music has ever done.